Good evening. Welcome to Thursday night Bible study. I'm Pastor David here at Forest Chapel Church. We're beginning a new series called Through the Bible in 1 Year. Now, we're following the general outline of a study that was developed by Dr. Alan Stringfellow, but from week to week, we may deviate from that and we may use some other resources as we follow through. Last week, we spent some time looking at the general structure of the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, how many books, what particular format each book was in. Is it a book of prophecy? Is it a history book? All of that. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that and you're new to getting into the Bible, that certainly would be something you could pull up again online and take a look at. Today, we're getting right into looking at the book of Genesis. Now, remember that the focus of this Bible study is to give a general introduction to all of the books of the Bible in 1 year. So that means we won't be able to get bogged down a lot with particular topics that we run across in a book. There will be particular stories that you will notice in your reading that we won't have time to spend a lot of time with discussing in class or on our Thursday night study. We'll be moving pretty quickly, looking at the main message of each book and the major characters that are there. Now, Genesis means birth or origin. It's the beginning of Scripture, and it is tied in with the New Testament. The Bible is not some bunch of books just thrown together. The Bible is one continuous story from Genesis to Revelation of a God who's giving his love letter to the people. Now, there are 17 books in the New Testament that either quote from Genesis or mention Genesis. And within those 17 books, they quote Genesis 60 different times. Jesus confirmed that Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the New Testament. Continually, several times in the Gospels, Jesus refers to Moses as the author of the law. When you read in the New Testament about Jesus having discussions or arguments with the scribes or the Pharisees or the Sadducees, often they will mention the law. When they mention the law, that has to do with the first 5 books of the Old Testament called the Pentateuch, and which were all written by Moses. That's what a Hebrew person even today will refer to as the law. Jesus, in his arguments and in his talking with them in the New Testament, confirms that these were indeed written by Moses. Now, Genesis tells us about the beginning of everything except for God. Chapter 1, beginning with verse 1, tells us about the beginning of the created world, creation. Then, towards the end of Genesis chapter 1, at verse 26, the creation of man and woman. Genesis chapter 3, sin begins with Satan's deception and the fall. Genesis chapter 4, family life. Adam and Eve are given 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And then beginning about the middle of chapter 4 and continuing through almost the end of chapter 29, it's the story of civilization, of events going on, God trying to reach out to civilization, and civilization often turning its back on God. Genesis chapter 10 and 11 are recording the great flood, and then after the flood, the beginning of nations. Now, there's kind of a break in the way that Genesis is covering God's story after chapter 11. Beginning with chapter 12, God is focusing on a particular people that he has called. Prior to that, everything is concerning civilization as a whole. And God zeroes in, beginning in chapter 12, on the people that he's calling. I'm going to share with you a little chart that will help you help keep the order of Genesis clear. Here it is, part one of Genesis. And you can see very clearly the change after part one. But part one, chapters 1 through 11, contains the creation, the fall of man, chapters 3 and 4, the flood, chapters 5 through 9, and then the crisis at the city of Babel, and that's chapter 10 and 11. Then, beginning with chapter 12, God extends his call to a particular people. And from chapter 12 through chapter 50, there will be 4 people who are the main focus of the rest of Genesis: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Abraham, the man of faith; Isaac, his beloved son; Jacob, whose name would change to Israel; and Joseph, who would go through a lot of suffering, but eventually a lot of glory as well. Now, that's how we're going to follow along this evening as we look at Genesis, and I'll just leave that up there for you as a little outline. Creation, chapters 1 and 2. Now, it's important that we recognize that this is not some human theory. This is a godly testimony. This is a declaration of the truth. Now, the time between what we see in verse 1 and verse 2, that is unknown, but it does leave room for all of the geological eras. What happens in verse 1 predates the actions of God in the 6 days. The 6 days are kind of a new beginning, or a recreation. We, humanity, are the subject. We are the goal. We are the crowning point, if you will, of God's creation. Chapter 1, verse 26 and verse 27. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and birds in the sky, over the livestock, and over all the wild animals, and over the creatures that move along the ground." God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. Now, notice that is said about no other creature, no other creation of God except for man. And there are 2 aspects that we share with God. God creates us in his image, his resemblance, and God also creates us in his character. When we are at our best, we exemplify some of God's character. He gives that to us. God breathes into man the spirit of life. And so humanity is body, soul, and spirit. Again, no other creature created that way. We are the crowning point of all of creation. No other creature is blessed like that. And then on the 7th day, God rested. Chapter 2, verse 2 and 3. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. We move then into Genesis chapter 3 and the fall of man. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. This is the tempting. Notice the serpent says to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" What's Satan doing here? He is putting doubt on God's word. Did he really say that? And then the serpent says, "You will not certainly die." So there's the first lie being told. And then Satan goes after the woman's pride. He says, "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So Satan goes after the ear, he goes after the eye, and he goes after the inward desire too. And then we have the yielding in verse 6. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some of it and ate it. She also gave it to her husband who was with her, very key, who was with her, and he ate it. And so we have the fall. Then from verse 7 down through verse 24, we see the results of this fall or this yielding to the temptation of Satan. Shame, fear, sorrow, curse, thorns, sweat. But in verse 9, we do see God's grace. God doesn't leave Adam alone. God doesn't look at his creation that has disappointed him and turn his head away. God calls out, he seeks out Adam, and he gives Adam the promise of a redeemer. Verse 15 reads like this. I will put enmity between you and the woman. He's speaking to Satan here. And between your offspring and hers, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. A paraphrase of that that I saw in another Bible study goes like this. And there will be intense hatred between Satan and Christ. Eventually, Christ will crush the head of Satan, and Satan will just bruise the heel of Christ. That's a prophecy of Jesus. Jesus would come as the Messiah to bear all of our pains, to bear our sins, to suffer for us. In chapter 4, we begin to see some of the fruit of that choice of Adam and Eve to eat the fruit, and that being the first murder. Chapter 4, verses 3 to 5. In the course of time, Cain, who was the firstborn, brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. The first murder. And God then grants to Eve another child, and this is Seth in verse 25. She gave birth to her son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel. The name Seth actually means granted. Now, between chapter 4, verse 25 and chapter 5, verse 3, we have a recording of the generations from Adam and Seth. In chapter 6, we see a mixing of the godly and the ungodly. We're reminded in the New Testament about mixing the godly and the ungodly in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Second Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Paul reminds us what a mistake that is. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? As a result of this mixing of the godly and ungodly, we find that judgment falls. Chapter 6, verses 5 through 7. And in chapter 7, the judgment does fall. But there was one man who found grace in the eyes of God, and that was Noah. Chapter 6, verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. After the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah. In chapter 9, in chapter 6, chapter 9, beginning at verse 8 and going through 17, records the covenant that God is making with Noah. Remember, a covenant is an agreement. In this passage, the word covenant is used 7 different times regarding this agreement that God is making. Moving to chapter 10, we have what we might call the Babel crisis. Genesis chapter 10 tells us the generations of the sons of Noah. And in chapter 11, we hear about God confusing the language of the people at Babel. Now, why was that? Well, the people had refused to obey God in spreading abroad to replenish the earth. When Noah and his family off of the ark, and that was God's request, that was God's order. That was what God wanted the people to do. They needed to replenish the earth after that great flood. But they were all kind of hanging out together, and they had become very egotistical and proud. And so God confuses their language, and they're all speaking in different languages. And so then they go off and they do what God had created them to do. Babel means confusion. So we move to chapter 12. This is where we have the change in the focus here of Genesis. And we're finding God calling to Abraham. Chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, so from your country, your people, and go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So he's calling to Abraham. And then he's going to make a covenant with Abraham. Go to the land I will show you. Verses 2 through 3. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. There are 7 promises in there. 1, God says, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. 2, he says, I will bless you. 3, I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. 5, I will bless those that curse you. I will bless those that bless you. 6, I will curse those that curse you. And 7, in you will all of the families of the earth be blessed. And that covenant would be confirmed over and over again in Genesis with the descendants of Abraham. At least 6 different times throughout Genesis, that covenant is going to be confirmed. Hebrews chapter 11, I know we're moving to the New Testament, is called the roll call of faith. Abraham was a man of faith. So look at what Hebrews has to say about Abraham. Hebrews chapter 11, beginning at verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. Even though he didn't know where he was going, by faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. So here we find Abraham obeying God, even though he didn't know where he was going. Abraham was going into strange lands, but he looked forward because he believed that God would be faithful to his promise. Abraham was tested. He lived by faith. And Abraham didn't live to see all of the things that God had promised. Abraham and Sarah have a son. His name is Isaac. Chapters 24 through 26 tell us the story about Isaac. Isaac is an obedient son. Chapter 24 records Isaac's search for a wife, and she would be Rebekah. Rebekah and Isaac would have twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Chapter 25, verses 23 through 26. This is what God said to Rebekah when the boys were within her. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. The name Jacob means tripper. He was tripping his older brother out of the womb. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. In chapter 26, verses 1 through 5, we have God's covenant that he made with Abraham being confirmed to Isaac. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. I will give them all these lands, and through your offspring, all the nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. So the covenant now moving from Abraham and being confirmed as well to Isaac. Chapters 27 through 36 tell us about the life of Jacob, the younger son of Isaac. Now, there's a lot in between here that went on between Jacob and Esau that we don't have time to get into, but we do find the covenant of Abraham is confirmed to Jacob. Chapter 28, verses 13 through 15. And this is part of when Jacob was sleeping and had his vision of the stairway to heaven. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. So the covenant now from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. Now, Jacob would end up having 12 sons by his two wives, Rachel and Leah, and their servants. Let's look at these 12 sons. See if I can get you here. The 12 sons. A busy, busy household. And as we'll find out a little bit later, quite a dysfunctional household at times. So to give you just a little bit of a background on how this happens, Jacob goes off to his parents' homeland to find a wife. His mother didn't want him to get a wife from the area where they were. Esau had married one of the women from the area, perfect example of godly versus ungodly. And Jacob's mom saw Esau being pulled away. So she sends Jacob off to find a wife from among their own people. So Jacob works for a man for 7 years. The man has two daughters, Rachel and Leah, and Jacob was in love with Rachel. So he worked 7 years to marry Rachel. Her father pulls a pretty awful trick. You know, back in those days when the marriage happened, the woman was dressed with her veil on and all that clothing. And her father, since Leah was actually the older of the two daughters, and by tradition there, the older was supposed to marry first, tricks Jacob and has Leah wearing the wedding garment. And so Jacob actually ends up marrying Leah. So then he has to work 7 more years if he wants to marry Rachel. So he works the 7 more years. Now he has 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. Rachel, whom he loved, Leah, whom he didn't love. But there are 12 sons. Leah bears sons right away. Rachel had trouble bearing a child. Rachel had trouble conceiving. The first 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And Judah would be the line of Jesus. And they were all born to Jacob by Leah. Then we look down here and we see Bilhah. Who is Bilhah? Bilhah is a servant of Rachel. Rachel looks and she sees that Leah is bearing sons to Jacob. And of course, in that time, for a woman not to be able to bear her husband children, especially sons, that was a disgrace. And Rachel was afraid that Jacob's attention would all go to Leah since she was being fruitful, bearing the children. And so Rachel says to Jacob, here's my servant, have children through her. And that's Dan, Naphtali. They are born through Bilhah. Okay, now the next 2 sons, Gad and Asher, their mother is Zilpah. Who's she? She is a servant of Leah. Apparently, Leah stopped having children as regularly as she had been. And she saw that Rachel was having success by letting Jacob have her servant Bilhah. And so Leah gives Jacob her servant Zilpah to have children by. And so Gad and Asher are born by Zilpah. Next sons, Issachar and Zebulun. Leah begins to conceive again, 2 more sons. And then Rachel, very late in life, she actually conceives, and Joseph is born. And Benjamin is born. And Rachel actually dies shortly after delivering Benjamin. But Joseph is a favored son. He is the first son through Rachel, and favored son because he's through the wife that his father truly loved. Quite a dysfunctional family, and it's going to get even more dysfunctional. Joseph, you probably heard the coat of many colors. So his father gave him this coat that many colors that none of the other 11 brothers had. And so there was a lot of jealousy. The other 11 brothers seemed to have had to take more of a share in the work on the farm, or the work around the land that they owed, that land that they owned. So at some point, the other 11 brothers are out working, and Jacob sends Joseph out to give them a message, or really to check on them. And they know that he's there to check on them. So they take him and they throw him in a pit, and they're going to leave him there. They think about killing him to start with. One of the brothers says, no, that's not going to be good. And so they throw him down in the pit. While they're trying to figure out what to do, a group of slave traders, caravan is coming through, and they sell their brother for 20 pieces of silver. And this caravan takes him off as a slave to Egypt. Chapters 39 through 48, they tell us about what happened to Joseph in this intervening time. He spends time in prison. He discovers he has a gift for interpreting dreams, and this leads to an opportunity to get out of prison. However, as he is out of prison and working for one of the officials in the government of Egypt, he is falsely accused, ends up in prison again. But his ability to interpreting dreams at some point catches the attention of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's been having some dreams. His trusted advisors, all of his people, they can't help him. They can't reveal to him what the dream means. And he hears about Joseph from one of the officials in his government. And so he calls Joseph in, and Joseph interprets the dream, and he interprets it accurately. And the interpretation of that dream leads to Egypt being saved from famine. They end up saving a lot of grain for a famine that is coming. And so as a reward for that, and seeing the potential in Joseph, Pharaoh gives him a position in the government where he's almost probably second in command to Pharaoh. And he's responsible for the distribution of all of the food, making sure that all of the people will have the food. Now, sometime after this, there is a famine back in Canaan. Now, Canaan is where Jacob, Joseph's father, lived. And Jacob sends the 10 oldest sons to Egypt to get grain. Now, of course, it's their brother Joseph that they must see to get approved to take grain. Now, he recognizes him. He recognizes them. They don't recognize him. Joseph tricks them. Remember, it was the 10 older brothers. Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin, didn't come on that trip. He tricks them into bringing his younger brother, Benjamin, back to Egypt. Now, again, there's a lot more to that story that you just have to read to get all of it. But when all is done, there is a beautiful reunion, which results in Jacob bringing his entire family to Egypt and settling there. Chapter 49 has the prophecy and blessing of the tribes of Israel. So to wrap up with Genesis, we see the supreme object of God, is to provide us a family through which Jesus is going to come. Galatians chapter 3, verse 14. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. I'll pull up a little timeline to let you see where we've traveled so far. So Genesis took us through, and here we go, creation, the light, the firmaments in the heaven, and traveling through those 6 days, through Adam, Cain and Abel and Seth. Some of the intervening that we didn't have time to talk about, Enoch, Methuselah. Who was Methuselah? Methuselah was the oldest living person, 969 years. We traveled through the flood here. Ham, Japheth, and Shem. Those are the sons of Noah. We've gotten through the Tower of Babel, the scattering of the nations. Here we begin with Abraham, then Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And so we are currently around 1800 BC, plus or minus, and we will pick up at that point next time. So how about a quiz? First question: where is the first prophecy of Jesus found in Genesis? Chapter and verse. Genesis 3, verse 15. When did the Sabbath day begin? Sabbath day began on the seventh day at sundown. And that would play into later on at Jesus' crucifixion and getting the bodies down from the cross. They had to get them down because that was the law before the Sabbath. This one's one for you to think about. In one word, how would you describe the fall of man? A lot of things you might say. Sad, weakness. Number 4, where do we find the people of Israel at the end of the book of Genesis? They're in Egypt. They're in Egypt. Can you list the 4 large events of Genesis? Creation, the fall, Babel, and the flood. Those are the 4 major events, Genesis chapter 1 through 11. Can you name the 4 outstanding people of Genesis from chapter 12 through chapter 50? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. So our study will pick up next week with Exodus. If you are going to try to read through Exodus between now and then, if you hit 6 chapters a day, you can do it. So I hope to see you next week. And as always, if you're local, don't have a church home, you are welcome to join us on Sunday mornings at 10:50 at Forest Chapel. We are right off of US 340, across from Sammy's Station. Have a blessed week.